right. So thank you for joining us today on Influencing the Shift 3.0. I'm Scott Preston, Manager of Recreation Aquatics with Municipality East Hants. And so today we're here to have a conversation again about related to inclusion in sport. And we have Cassie here, and we're so excited. Cassie's actually been leading the series. This time you're going to be interviewed, so this is going to be
kind of weird.
Yeah, I'm glad I have the pleasure to do this. So Cassie, why don't we start off by, you can introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your experience in relation to sport and inclusion with persons with disabilities.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Scott. And thanks for kind of leading the Trojan horse on this interview. Definitely weird to be on the other side, but excited to still be here. So for those that actually don't know who I am, so my name is Cassie Manuel, or Cassandra Manuel, if my dad's listening. And I am the Provincial Recreation and Sport Inclusion Project Manager. This is actually a new role that I just transitioned into with Recreation Nova Scotia. And it really came from this Northern Region inclusion consultant role that I've been in for the last 2 years. And that's kind of where this Influencing the Shift conference stemmed from. But in terms of like inclusion and sport and my experiences, so a bit about me, my background's in therapeutic recreation. And I completed my degree at Douglas College in Vancouver, BC. And since I was 18, I've been involved in community kind of inclusion, recreation, and sport in different capacities. So at first I was, actually the one managing volunteers for a city that supported, their model was one-on-one support that were volunteer based. So my youngest volunteer was like 13 and my oldest was 66.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I would do all the just inclusion training for them to make them feel like equipped with some skills, as well as just kind of do the check-ins and management of them during especially like summer camps. So that was really my first introduction to community rec. And I stayed in that role for about 3 years. In that role, we never really had access to adapted equipment. It wasn't really a part of that model. But then I worked for another municipality in Lower Mainland, and there is called a crisis support. So that one was a bit more similar flavor of like helping support the one-on-one supports, but more so like going wherever the more, I call them fun kids were. But typically the ones that experience a bit more challenging like behaviors. And so, in that situation, I found that was where we started introducing more like adapted equipment pieces. And I say adapted equipment pieces really like diligently, because to me, like adapted equipment pieces are just like adapting equipment for, different purposes than maybe what they're meant for. So, in this sense, like I found that it was a lot of like programming equipment, like beanball or like, the play putty, like as like a sensory tool to like help with regulation and programming. And really that was the first time that I kind of was introducing these different, I would say smaller pieces of equipment, but to help, regulate and integrate the child into a program. Which was really neat to see, because I think it just helped others kind of recognize that like, oh, this gushy ball thing has more than just the purpose of playing, right? Like there's other ways it can be utilized. So that was a really neat experience to just kind of, it be introduced to that world. I also then kind of supported inclusive swimming lessons. So the model was essentially we had a I was the one-on-one for each child, and then we had a lifeguard or swim coach teach the whole lesson, but then we individually would work with the child. So then I was introduced to some different cool like aquatic adapted equipment. We had everything from like the wheelchair lift at the swimming pool to these really cool, they were like not bodysuits, but like I'm really bad with names, but it's like the flotation
Yeah.
belts almost.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so we use those a lot for our adapted swimming lessons, which I loved. I thought they were great. Because I worked with anyone from the age of like 5 years old to 17 years old. So, some of the 17-year-olds were taller than me. So having the flotation belts and like other little equipment, we use like noodles. Again, like some of it was just your typical equipment, but used differently. But then other pieces were more unique, like the flotation belts, or like the water sifter board to like get people in and out of the water. Yeah, so that was interesting. Yeah, so I would say that like my experiences with adapted equipment, and like in our TR program, even like we have a whole course around sport equipment, like adapted sport. So they make you actually like try out the different sports. So we did like sport wheelchair, sludge, but like instead of being like on the ice, they were like wheel kits. I don't know if you've seen the wheel kits before, but yeah. So they're quite fun, but then you just realize that you have no abdominal strength whatsoever.
I think you brought up, something really interesting, for listeners here is, us, people just experiencing these adapted equipment themselves, trying it out. I think we're always just giving it to our clients who need them, but if you don't just use it to see what it feels like, right, in yourself.
Yeah, I think that's one part of my like education part that I kind of took for granted at the time, that I reflect back on and realize like how impactful it was they were really highlight, like giving those experiences of like being in the equipment. Like there was even one simulation where we actually had to like travel our municipality in a wheelchair. And again, like just like with those like lived experiences, like I know how some people have different thoughts about it, but like I think if we are the ones, providing community service, like it does give a different perspective. So when then you're providing supports or providing programs or whatever it may be, like you do kind of think of some things that you probably wouldn't have if you didn't have that experience. So I always recommend trying it out. Like there's always like value in like firsthand experience. And I think that's why we put so much like, not pressure, but like emphasis on first person perspective. And so, yeah, like I would say that was definitely something that I took away from my undergrad. And then honestly, like I support more like mental health throughout the rest of my career as a therapeutic recreation practitioner, like after graduating, and in different capacities again, but more so like community health. And then when I moved here to Nova Scotia, I was reintroduced to community and inclusion, and I've really been like enjoying just like learning, because I think something that people forget too is like, because I say I have a background in therapeutic recreation, I think people assume like you're an expert in adapted sport. It's like, no, like there are so many equipment pieces out there. Like I am not an expert at all of them, but I've put together some hippocamps, and we have I think we have an education understanding of the importance and the different types of equipment that are out there. We might not necessarily know the mechanics about all of it, but like, there are definitely, just like that knowledge we definitely have learned the importance of. So in this role, like really in 2020, when pandemic hit, like I was supporting these communities, and I realized that, okay, like how are communities shifting? And really they were focusing on equipment loan. And as part of that, right, these adapted equipment pieces came into conversation. And then through that, it was recognizing, okay, wow, like there's this need in community and there's this knowledge gap. So how do we address that? And how do we ensure that, people like the frontline staff do feel comfortable with these equipment pieces, or feel comfortable to like promote the equipment pieces? And I think that's where now, and why I'm speaking today, is because the last 2 years, I've really been honing in on that component and those pieces. And so it started with like a video project, which, if you're watching the series, they're also available on the YouTube channel. So it's great just to see like, these available. And I thought I had one near me, but maybe I don't, but a QR code sticker. So we like made these QR code stickers to go on the equipment pieces. So really the knowledge translation. And again, like I by no means am the expert, but like pulling kind of the threads and the pieces of what I know and what the community would probably want to know, and then finding the experts to speak to those pieces. I find I'm kind of the middleman between all of it. And so due to that, my knowledge is growing in this area extensively. So,
Definitely. Well,
yeah,
there's always learning, I guess, right? No one can ever really be an expert. You're always learning, and it's how much effort you want to continue to put into learning. Um,
exactly.
Really neat to hear your story. I mean, I've known you for a number of years now, and working with you in different capacities, but it's really cool to learn more about your past experience. And you kind of already went into the next question, really. I think we'll skip that, which is just sharing your experience with adaptive equipment, because I think throughout your experiences, that's what you've done, and I think those are really cool stories. Do you have anything else you'd like to add to that, or?
Um, Not that I can think of off the top of my head. No, yeah, I kind of did go on a tangent there, which, as you know me very well, that typically happens. Um,
There's a tangent in the right direction. It's okay.
but no, yeah, I think that, like, in terms of adaptive equipment pieces, I would say that that pretty much sums me up nicely. In terms of sport and recreation and inclusion, I will also mention that, like, and I don't think I mentioned this piece, but when I first moved to Nova Scotia, I did complete a master's as well at Dalhousie, and that was focusing on municipal recreation inclusion policies. And I would say that equipment actually was one of the biggest kind of policies that I did notice was either not really addressed, to be completely honest, in the way that I thought it would be addressed, although it was identified in a lot of frameworks as like a need or something that was going to be provided. So like it is something that I'm recognizing is like an area of work, and whether or not you know, it wasn't clearly my main focus in my thesis work or in any of my work, you know, adapted equipment isn't the primary focus, but I do see it always kind of pop up in these other conversations. So I think it's a
Yeah.
really important one that we're having today. So thanks for leading it.
Yeah. No, no problem. So I guess kind of leading in from that, like, so knowing that adaptive equipment pieces are becoming more recognized in mainstream sport and recreation organizations, what tools or resources are available to support the confidence and competence of staff when working with these equipment pieces?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm getting it a lot. And there's a couple of different like responses to that I have, so I'll try to keep them concise as possible. But if I veer off, I apologize. Um, so you know, in terms of resources available, say there isn't a lot for community service providers. You know, and that's kind of where my work left off after this video project that we did, was kind of recognizing, okay, like people want more tools, people want a standardized process in doing this type of programming, or providing this type of, you know, service. And yeah, there isn't really a method. And so in that being said, what I'm finding is a lot of in-house kind of processes being made. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think, you know, our previous speaker that we had on the subject like really spoke to that, about like, you know, it is just about trying things out. But I also recognize that not every, and especially our volunteer sport coaches, like don't have the capacity to necessarily do all that pre-planning that, you know, maybe another more, you know, substantial organization might have the resources to be able to do. So in kind of knowing that, like one of the things that I've trying to address is actually creating some sort of guide, to create kind of like okay, this is where you can start, you know. My hands way over here. This is where you can start, and then these are all the probes that you want to think about at the beginning, and then here's all the probes you want to think about when you're purchasing equipment, or you know, all the probes you want to think about when you're thinking about like, or have you thought about evaluating the program, like, you know, the importance of that piece. So I would say that unfortunately right now in terms of tools there isn't as many, but I think in saying that there is a lot of human resources that I think don't, not everyone always like accesses. Um, you know, it's easier for me to do a quick Google search than to have a phone call with somebody, in terms of time, right? Because everything's about time. I just am like always reflect on that. But I think like something I've been recognizing through conversations is how much like our human resources, each other, and networking is actually a really great tool, especially with this type of program. because not every, sport organization or rec organization or community organization is the same. And so
Mhm.
it's nicer to have examples from a person or organization that's similar to your organization, because then it's the not the answers, but the strategies are probably a bit more similar
Mhm.
and doable, right? Like, because that's the thing is, if you don't, it's not about recreating the wheel. It's just about taking all the different ways that something's been done and trying to say, okay, here's the different ways worked. Here's the challenges experienced with it. Like, think about these things. And so, for example, the IWK, like, they are specifically all, have a program around adapted equipment pieces.
Mhm.
And they're really emphasizing the importance of, we're here to support community org. So I always say, like, go to them, have a conversation, they'll direct you to, based on your program, your sport, what you might want to consider, based on who you're trying to support, right? So they're always a great, but then also just looking at, like, and I think earlier in the series we had Challenger Baseball, who's another great, like, more veteran, I'll say, in experiencing adapted equipment pieces and the different components with that. And again,
Mhm.
like, these individuals, most people want to share the information. Most people want to have the opportunity to brag about all the cool things they did. I
Yeah.
I know that I do. So it's
Yeah.
like, right. So recognizing that, like, yeah, like, pick up the phone and just have
Mhm.
a phone conversation. There's a lot more that can be a takeaway. But then for me, as kind of this provincial role, like, I'm recognizing the need and the opportunity to have these, like, spaces where it's just about networking and it's just about
Yeah.
creating this conversation hub. And so, yeah, there's kind of two sides to it, right? Like, I know another conversation everyone has is like, how do you choose a vendor? Like, how do you pick? And most of the time, and I think we heard this in other conversations, like, it's just about, finding out what's out there, and or calling someone else and being like, well, who do you use and why'd you choose them? And everyone has, the different parameters to why they purchase something, whether it's cost or,
Yeah.
local, not local, like, all these things. So I think it's just having to, having the conversation will probe your thinking and kind of go, okay, yeah, like, that makes sense to me. We'll do it that way, right?
Yeah.
So
Definitely.
yeah, I think, yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think, for the listeners here today or whenever you're listening, is just to know that, half of why we're doing this is so you can stay connected, whether it's reaching out directly to you, Cassie, or people you see on this call, the information, like, pick up the phone, talk to people. If you have ideas on initiatives, people that are doing the same thing or want to help you because they've either paved the path themselves and had to do the same thing. So the more we can work together, it makes things easier and more effective than trying to do things just on your own.
Oh yeah, you're so much more successful working together. And
Yeah.
to your point, Scott, yeah, that's really my goal in this role, is to be the kind of, again, like, this middleman, where at least, like, people who are middlewomen,
Yeah.
but as, like, people, if we can create a common place to have these conversations, then I can identify, okay, what are the themes of the conversations and what are the needs. The hope is to be able to create a one-stop shop where you can go and be like, I need resources around this. And then whether they're from, the States, Australia, it's like, it's concrete examples of here's how it's worked, because it is hard to think that everything we do here locally is the best way. Like, we just don't know, like, right? So, but again, like, knowing that you don't have the time to go and research up what all the different ways this one program's been done, it's like, how can
Right.
I create these small little almost tip sheets or something along those lines to create kind of these pathways of, like, if I want to just know what the most important 5 things are about running an inclusive swim program or whatever, like, here's what I should need to know, kind of thing. So I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
excited to see. I'm hopeful that as these kind of programs grow, there will be more resources around it. I definitely see it not just here in Nova Scotia, but across the country, really. This being a
Mhm.
really dominant conversation. So I'm excited to see what others have, created. I know that a lot of work right now is around adaptive equipment pieces for playgrounds, which isn't really the flavor of today's conversation, but like, I
Yeah,
think we'll get there. I think this will become a conversation.
awesome. So if I'm a community sport organization listening to this right now, or, you know, where would I start, do you think, if I'm looking for adapted equipment pieces that are available? I guess what would you recommend to decide on which organization to go to or what to get? Like, what would you recommend, I guess, is my first steps?
Yeah. So really, I'm gonna sound like a bit of a broken record here, but like
Yeah.
your community members are really your first step. Like, and it doesn't have to be this extravagant like survey monkey thing, like it can be a Google form, like, hey, we want to run this sport, do you experience barriers in this sport? What do you need to be successful in this sport?
Mhm.
Right. And I think like your community members, the ones that aren't interested, like they're gonna know, they're gonna, they're gonna tell you, like if you give them the space to have that conversation, I think like, and
Mhm.
if you feel like, oh, like I tried that and we didn't really get a response, like then it's about relationship building, because I think the other component to this is really around like needing to ensure that you have a strong enough relationship with your, I'm going to say, underrepresented groups in your community, that they feel comfortable telling you what they need, right? So like there's kind of two sides to it, but I always say go to your community, ask the questions, and they're going to give you the guidance of what they need, because perhaps, it's simple as like an accessible facility, right? Like maybe I didn't come because I can't actually get to inside the door of the facility that you run the program at, which sometimes
Right.
happens, which is unfortunate, right? And sometimes it's just a matter of like, yeah, I just need to, whether it's a lift or um, a special type of seat, or dimmed lights is always like something that I'm always like, if you're in a gym and if you're sensory sensitive, like we always talk about physical disabilities, so I like to give other examples sometimes.
Yeah.
There are like these other kind of adapted equipment pieces that just help to create more structure, even, right, like a schedule, like a I don't know if you've ever seen like the Velcro schedules that you can just like put up on a board or something like that. But
Yeah.
to me, that's an adapted equipment piece, right? Like again, not your norm, but like as a
Yeah.
sport, as a coach, if you can create that structure, if you can create that safe space, and really put some thought into like where you're hosting it, how, like making sure everyone can get through the door, have that schedule ready and available, have some timers, and then go into the bigger pieces of equipment. Like, do I need a sledge? Do I need a, but like, again, like your audience is going, or your community members are going to tell you like what they need if you give them that space to. So that's really what I would recommend. And then the rest kind of falls into place, right? Like clearly you have to think about things like financial stability, like, right? Like what can I afford to do? Um,
Right.
can you afford to buy the really expensive piece of equipment? Or, what smaller things can I do? And then if
Mhm.
you can't afford to do those pieces, who are the partnerships that you should be looking for then? Because again, like I really believe, and Scott, you kind of said it already, but like we're stronger together. So to
Right.
think that like, you can't lean on others, like granted, like I know communication, it takes a bit more time and effort, but like the product at the end to me would be so much stronger with that kind of partnership. And again, like the partnerships piece could look different. It could even just be like a partnership with a local bike shop or something to help with the maintenance, right? Like it doesn't
Right.
have to, it can vary. But I would say, yeah, like in terms of like, and don't bite off more than you can chew, like start small.
Yeah. Definitely.
Because I think again, like it's easy for like some larger organizations to buy the sledges, have the rink time, do all these things, and then get three participants and say, oh, it didn't work. And it's like,
Mhm.
no, like it still worked, it's just, again, it takes more time. It takes more time to get
Mhm.
that uptake piece. So give yourself that grace as well to just, be okay with only having three people at your right? First multi-sport, whatever. So I would just say
Mm,
like give yourself some of that grace, but also like definitely communicate with your partners, communicate with your community, and then
mm.
through that you'll be successful.
I love that. And you brought up a good point around, what adapted equipment looks like for different disabilities. I know we immediately, I think people's minds go to, physical disabilities, but there's a lot of things out there, around autism and attention difficulties and different pieces of equipment that can help engage, participants in a type of programming, whether that's like visual cues and things like that. That really, those are the strategies that if you say we have this stuff, I mean, there's people that aren't doing programming because they might feel their child just couldn't participate in that because they don't have the attention to do that, or will struggle with other areas. And those kind of supports, I know they're not like a huge apparatus of equipment, they can be in-house made and things like that. It kind of opens up the larger picture of what we're talking about with inclusion in sport or in anything, really.
Yeah, and I think like that's I mean that word inclusion to me can have so many like meanings to it and connotations to it, right? And this context, I think it's important for the audience to remember like we are speaking about disability, but even within the word disability, like there are multitude, cognitive, neurodevelopmental, like physical, like there's just so many types, and I think within that there's so many different needs, and so it is
Mhm.
important, I think, for our audience to remember, and that's why I say like even like I feel sometimes this is a gray area for me about self-identifying. Like I don't want people to just be like, what kind of disability do you have? And that's why I always go with like, what kind of supports do you need? Because really
Mhm.
like I know there are times where, yes, the label matters, but in this community recreational sports setting, to me, it's like, what do you need to be successful, right? Like, what do you need from
Mhm.
us to be successful? And I think asking that question and providing some examples, like a schedule, like a sensory safe space, like a, physical adapted piece of equipment, like a sledge, like providing those examples, but then leaving space for other, like, again, like it's just gonna, you're they're going to tell you what they need, especially if you create that safe space to be able to have the conversation. So, yeah, it's definitely something that I try to be more vocal about because I don't think it gets as much time and recognition. And I think it just has as much of an impact. And I will say this, like I've worked with multitude of different individuals over the years in a multitude of different spaces over the years. Um, I was just thinking about it. I've almost been in this industry for 10 years now, actually. And it's like one of the things that I hear over and over and over again from the participants like perspective is if I feel socially included in the space, I'll figure the
Mhm.
rest out.
Mhm.
I've heard someone say, I'll crawl through the front door if I can't get in through the front door, if I know that that's a welcoming and like socially inclusive space. Like if
Mhm.
I feel that feeling of sense of belonging, like the rest doesn't matter to me. And I think that's really strong because I think it just like makes me remember that like this is only a component of a, bigger a component of the environment that we're creating. So it's like,
Mhm.
right. So I think like in that sense too, like I know we're talking about adapted equipment and I think it has a place, and I definitely think that there is a strong value to providing different equipment pieces. But I think we need to also remember like the stronger sense of belonging, that stronger sense of joy comes from just feeling belong. So, and that's
Mhm.
represented through providing adapted equipment pieces and through conversation and through just like, yeah, like it's always sad to me when a family feels like, oh, but will my kid feel supported here? Like, I don't know if we can
Mhm.
consider adapted equipment piece, but sometimes I say like just having volunteers, that one-to-one support ready and able, like to
Mhm.
me, like that's a huge one as well, right? Because then parents are like, okay, like you got this, like, oh, okay, like
Right.
you're prepared, like, oh, okay, like, oh, and it's just like you can feel that shift, and then they're excited because
Mhm.
they're like, oh, like you're not kicking my kid out of the program because they're challenging, you're keeping them because you have the tools to support them. And
Right.
that's kind of what I'll leave with, is just reminding the audience, like, yeah, like this is a component of your whole environment. So remember to kind of assess your environment as a whole. And pre-planning it, man, it's so important.
And I got to just add in, because you brought up something really important, and I think it just comes back to, make sure that you have the compassion there, and understand maybe what these parents or what the children or any of the participants have gone through in the past with programming, because they might have been kicked out of a program, they might have had that experience, and it's not going to be easy right away. Sometimes integrating and just understanding that someone's past experiences might have also be a deterrent for them to participate in sport as well.
Yeah, and I think that's where, like, Scott, there's importance for an organization to really have this self-reflection and inner reflection around, like, what does inclusion mean for your organization? And I don't mean to sound really blunt here, but I feel like I have to in some way. Like, you know, I recognize not everyone can do every aspect of inclusion work. And I quote inclusion work because, to me, like, I still don't know how I feel about the term sometimes, because it's just so broad and it means so many different things to every person listening, probably. But so, identify to your organization, what does inclusion mean for your organization? What are you willing to commit to? And then be very transparent with your audience about that. Say, this is how we intend to be inclusive. Like, this is how we intend to, ensure persons that are XYZ or experience XYZ challenges are going to be supported in our space. And I think recognizing that maybe the organization can't support a person in every capacity possible is actually really, like, the smarter thing to do is recognize, your limits, but having that transparency and as a community member who lives with a disability, I'm going to look, and if I see, oh, you're inclusive and that's it, I'm going to assume you're not talking about me. And I'm going to assume that space isn't inclusive to me. So if you have, we're inclusive and this is how, I can see, oh, you made sure you have universal accessible washrooms. Oh, you made sure, or you do provide adaptive equipment pieces, right? Like, oh, you are talking about me. So I think, like, we need to put a bit more time into just not using the term inclusion, but describing how that looks to your organization. And then doing so, hopefully people don't have as much fear about, oh, you can't support me or my child, or,
That's right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Cassie. I think that really concludes our questions here today. It was awesome to hear your story and your insight on adaptive equipment. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for having me. Thanks for tuning in to today's conversation on Influencing the Shift 3.0. Influencing the Shift would not be possible without the Northern Inclusion Access Committee. Its representatives are made up from varying organizations within the northern region of Nova Scotia, including partners from East Hants, Colchester, Pictou, and Cumberland counties. These partners identified a gap in service delivery within the sport and recreation sector when providing opportunities for persons living with disability. We all play an important role in shifting towards a more inclusive sport and recreation sector for individuals with varying abilities. Let's start by influencing the shift.